So again, welcome everyone. We're gathered here today for one big purpose, to bring about a nature positive future. This is the NTC Now, one of the gatherings of the Nature Tech Collective. We're a coalition of organizations that are working relentlessly across categories towards this nature positive future. The members of our collective are the ones deploying restoration projects, like Clara. They're the ones crafting the technology to keep track of the progress we make for these ecosystems. And they're the ones creating the platforms that visualize this progress in ways that others can understand, relate to, or act on. Or they're the ones funneling resources into deploying this restoration work. I'm Paige. I'm the head of community at the Nature Tech Collective. And each week we bring together, where every 2 weeks we bring together experts who are harnessing technology to regenerate our natural world. So throughout our content arc that we're setting up this year, we've been systematically building the foundations for understanding nature tech fundamentals. Today, we're diving into a fascinating case study of nature tech deployment through the lens of a public-private partnership for ecosystem restoration. It's a groundbreaking collaboration between Land Life, which Clara represents, and the Colorado State Land Board to reforest wildfire-affected ecosystems. This session is going to explore key themes, the broader context of state land boards in the US and their potential for nature-based solutions, and that's probably applicable to other areas in the world, and the process of building trust between private companies and public institutions, the technical aspects of project design for reforestation, how land life establishes baselines and measures impact, and the financial considerations that make these projects viable despite challenging conditions. So we'll also discuss how this partnership balances carbon sequestration with biodiversity and watershed benefits. I'm delighted to welcome Clara Rowe, Director of Strategic Partnerships at Land Life, who's been instrumental in developing this first-of-a-kind forest carbon lease. Clara, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we dive into the specifics of everything, can you introduce yourself, Land Life, and I guess what state land boards are?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Paige. Nice to see all of you. Looking forward to the discussion. So, quickly on me, I have been working in sustainability for coming up on 15 years now. And for the last 5 years, I've been working increasingly at the intersection of nature and technology. So, before joining Land Life, I was the founding CEO of a nonprofit called Restore, a platform that democratizes access to data for restoration and conservation projects across the globe. And it's actually how I came to know Land Life, who, as a larger restoration actor, was really committed to transparency and knowledge sharing and brought a lot to the community that we were building at Restore. So as I've transitioned over to Land Life and been in the project developer implementer seat, it's been really interesting to see the way that perspectives differ when you're thinking about the entire system versus focusing in on implementing on the ground. Land Life, as Paige described, is a nature restoration company. We're an implementer, and we're on a mission to help restore the nearly 2 billion hectares of degraded land that we know, thanks to scientific research, are good candidates for forest. And we operate in highly degraded landscapes. So those are places where, for example, catastrophic wildfire has made it very difficult for natural regeneration to take place, or places where decades and decades of overgrazing by livestock has led to completely degraded and compacted soil. And we focus on restoring native species, biodiverse forests that are delivering a whole suite of benefits to people and to the environment. Our largest operations are in North America, in Spain and Portugal, and in Australia. And in those geographies, we fund the majority of our work through the voluntary carbon market. But we also have projects that are non-carbon financed in Mexico and in Indonesia that are ongoing, and a suite of other projects that we helped get off the ground in other parts of the world. We very much see science and technology as core to our ability to do high quality restoration, and that's really key to our DNA. And so today I'm really excited to get to tell you about a landmark deal that we recently secured to reforest wildfire impacted land in Colorado in the US, where we're helping to fund public education along the way. And so the kind of social and environmental benefits that come together in this project have been very, very exciting to bring together. So as a quick background on state land in the US and specifically state land boards. State land boards are this strange state level agency set up in the late 1800s in the US to transfer land from the federal government to states. It's really important to note here that there is, of course, an entire story of land grabbing and broken treaties that resulted in the federal government controlling a lot of this land in the first place. And I want to acknowledge that history. I'm not going to go into it today. But 21 Western states in the US have state land boards now. And collectively, state land boards are the second largest landowner in the US after the federal government. So it represents this huge opportunity in terms of land ownership and land management as we think about land use change and we think about what nature delivers across land. In Colorado specifically, the state land board manages 3 million acres of land and actually 4 million acres of subsurface rights. And their mandate as an agency is to generate revenue through the state, specifically for public education, by long-term stewardship of their land. And they do this by leasing land to many, many different sectors. So they will lease their land to mining, to oil and gas, to grazing, to hunting, to recreation. They have all sorts of interagency partnerships because, again, they represent this huge portfolio of land across the state. And in February of this year, after months and months of deep engagement, the Colorado State Land Board approved us as Land Life for its first ever lease for forest carbon to reforest wildfire impacted land in their portfolio. So they'll be receiving not only the benefits of reforestation on this land, but also a lease agreement that is going to bring direct revenue to public schools in the state. I'll pause there.
Fantastic. Okay, so Land Life is a project developer mostly focused on reforestation. And the hard part about this project must have been building trust with the Colorado State Land Board. It is the first of its kind, like it's been said in a lot of communications, but that's actually what's really interesting here is, well, actually, could you share the story of how you built that relationship to make it?
Yeah, absolutely. Relationships take time and they take trust is, my big simple take home from this work. Land Life began engaging with the Colorado State Land Board actually several years ago when we first started working in the state of Colorado. We started working on private land. And at that point, we didn't have the track record to come to a large state agency and say, let's talk about partnership. And so really, it's been several years of building up credibility in our work in the state. We've done nearly 5,000 acres of reforestation on private lands now, and through that engaged with lots of civil society and government partners. And that has been an important piece of kind of the foundation of trust building, and to show that we're doing quality work year after year, we're bringing in the right partners to the table. And so when we checked in again with the land board last July, we were really able to pick up a more frequent engagement cadence. We took time to understand their priorities, the way that they work internally, the way that we might be able to fit into their business. We spent a lot of time providing as much context as possible to the land board on the voluntary carbon market, on how it works. It's an incredibly confusing space, even if you work in it. And so if you're an agency that engages with many sectors across the board, and here's a new sector coming to you, you want to understand where is the money coming from, and who's regulating it or not, and who sets the rules. And so a lot of the work was really helping on that education. We spent time together in the field visiting sites once we had progressed enough to really be thinking about the possibility of concrete partnership. And so time in the field together is always an invaluable part of trust building. And And we really openly and transparently discussed what a fair lease price would look like, right? They don't have a standard price for forest carbon because they've never done this lease before. They know exactly what they'll charge an oil and gas company. They know exactly what a grazing lease looks like. But this was, a fresh start. And so we really worked openly together to say, hey, based on our understanding of the, financing structure here, here's what we think we could offer. How does that seem to you? How does that fit into your broader lease price kind of portfolio? And that, again, we just did as transparently as possible. And then I guess the final thing I'll say is, as is so often the case, building strong relationships individually is key to it, right? Ultimately, organizations are about the people who are in them. And so that, it's about spending time with those people and making sure that you both, respect and understand how they work and what they're working for.
Right. So that's the start of any project or that needs to be implemented, is that trust building. And just like a tiny question is, we talked about how this is like an unusual project because from what I remember, it's a 40-year lease, which is not something they typically do, right? Usually their leases are much shorter.
Right. Yeah, as we've talked about, new structure of a lease for them. They've never had a forest carbon lease before. And that required creating kind of a new set of agreements based on our requirements in order to be able to do this work. So yes, in order to have ensure the permanence of this project, we required a 40-year lease. So that was kind of the minimum starting point. They tend to work on a 10 to 15-year timescale. So we really had to, think and talk with them about, well, what does this mean for the long term of these particular pieces of land that have been wildfire impacted? It meant ensuring that they would have a commitment to keeping the land forested in the long term. So again, thinking about their portfolio there. And some restrictions on overlapping leases, right? They might have a grazing lease that overlaps with a hunting lease or a recreation lease. And there were some restrictions for us, like for the first 10 or 15 years of the project, we have to keep any cattle off of this area. They'll eat seedlings. Eventually they can come back, but that was a restriction. So we had to just work through all of those kind of different, deviations from the way that they normally work.
Okay, and so while you're negotiating all of those points, you're also analyzing the land itself.
That's right.
To understand if it's viable for you as land life and your business model. So can you walk us through your approach to evaluating and designing a reforestation project? What does it look like, that process from assessment to, I guess, the beginning of implementation, which you say is in spring, correct?
Yes, it's planned for spring of next year. So this is typical of the way that we do assessment in other parts of the world, but I'll talk us through kind of what we did in this particular case, pretty typical of project flow. So to begin with, we will take a larger suite of properties and evaluate them. So in this case, the State Land Board had identified about a dozen properties that had burned in recent years and that they knew they were interested in having reforested. And so we did a remote sensing analysis. We have an internal remote sensing dashboard that allows us to input lots of different data layers and images. And we took the sites that the State Land Board had shared with us and basically, again, through purely remote sensing analysis, looked at things like the total area that had burned, what natural regeneration we were seeing occur, how rocky was the area, which will impact ability to plant, the aspect, so what direction are pieces of the land facing, what's the average slope, and all of that is helping us get a sense of both eligibility of the property, suitability for reforestation, operational feasibility before we ever put boots on the ground. We then were able to discard several of the sites that just seemed like they would be too technically difficult or not good candidates for carbon finance. And so then we did initial site assessments on 7 of those properties. And this spring, it's actually happening this week and next, we'll be doing follow-up site visits on the ground to confirm plantable areas. And from there, we'll work on modeling out planting design. So that includes the species mix, that includes, where within the property we can plant based on where fire has burned, where there are rocks, et cetera. And then that will lead us to the point of planting, which, as I say, is scheduled for next spring. So we already did the initial seedling order based on our estimates of what species we would use and plantable areas. And so that, that already had to happen about a year in advance in order to be able to get to the point where we'd be ready to put seedlings in the ground.
And LandLife is both a project developer, but also a technology company. You're kind of hybrid in that way. Can you speak just a tiny bit more as to the role technology plays in your initial site assessment? You've touched upon it with the remote sensing. Is there anything else there worth mentioning?
Yeah, we built this technology in-house. It allows us to look at climate, terrain, land use, soil, fire history, tree cover, et cetera, to inform every step of the process for us, our evaluation and design, the way that we forecast carbon, which I'll speak to specifically, and then eventually allows us to do monitoring of the project over time. So that's a key part of it. We will bring in external, algorithms that will do the, land cover assessment, for example, external imagery. We've just built the tool that allows us to assess in the way that we find most useful for each stage of the process, available data there. And then we have an in-house carbon model, and I think later on we'll talk in a bit more detail about that. But that allows us to run an initial carbon capture projection report. So basically, based on what we know about the site and our preliminary assumptions of area that we'll be planting and species composition, we can estimate the total sequestration and the rate of carbon accumulation for the forest that we'll be planting over the 40-year life of the carbon part of the project, the carbon financed part. And this is really important for project financing and being able to understand credit issuance timing, et cetera. And then a lot of this kind of design process also helps us determine what technology we might use at a given site. So that's simple hardware, and we've done some of the development ourselves around this of things like the cocoon, which is this biodegradable water container that you can bury around a seedling in areas where you are really dealing with drought conditions, or the shuttle, which is another biodegradable, in this case, seed incubator that you put in certain areas if you're planting seeds and if you're worried about seeds drying, animals eating those seeds, et cetera. And so we do think both about the software and hardware part of technology when we're thinking about our work on the ground. And then, of course, if we have time for it, happy to talk about sort of the post-planting ways that we use technology, which are really around monitoring and transparency of our impact over time.
What are some of the red flags that determine if a site is unsuitable for carbon financing, for example, or for any of this?
Yeah, so, of course, we pay attention to the core eligibility criteria for carbon finance, right? And so, I'll just focus on three, but permanence, knowing that this is, we're putting trees in the ground that are going to become part of a forest that is there in the long term. And so in order to evaluate permanence, we look at the risk of a reforested site losing tree cover again. That might be through additional wildfire risk. So it's really important to understand what the context of wildfire is in the areas where we're working, how likely it occurs, what other mitigation measures are happening in the landscape. And then not so relevant to Colorado, but many parts of the world, this question is also what is going to be the deforestation pressure coming from other land use types, and what does that mean for our understanding of the longevity of this forest? From an additionality perspective, right? So would the project happen without carbon financing? We have to look at a number of things. So, one, is there other funding available? And in this case, it's clear that there's insufficient state funding to reforest the land. There's barely funding to do wildfire mitigation itself, let alone reforest areas that have been impacted. And so it's, very clear that bringing in outside finance here means that you can reforest areas that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. And then also a very relevant question here is, how likely is natural regeneration to occur in a given site? And what is it, therefore, that we are adding by planting trees? If many areas are wildfire adapted, and wildfire is a natural part of the regime, and you will have, forests grow back over time. The thing that's happening now with climate change, of course, and with the way that we've managed forest historically across the US, is that you're having larger, hotter fires, which means that natural regeneration is less and less likely to occur. So we have to look very carefully at natural regeneration patterns when we're thinking about the additionality of our work on a given site. And then finally, we look at leakage when we're thinking about eligibility criteria. That basically is, does reforesting this area have the potential to put pressure on surrounding forests? And in this case, there's, we basically have to look at what are the grazing, trends in this area, and are we likely to be displacing grazing onto other forested areas if we're bringing back forest here. And so all of those things go into our eligibility assessment.
And so obviously throughout all of this, you have to work with several stakeholders and neighboring property owners, as you're just mentioning. This is a collaborative process. How does it shape your project design? Can you explain how this also might feed into like a landscape approach as to not just the site, but the whole?
Yeah. Stakeholder engagement is always critical to project development, and has been especially critical to both getting us where we are today, and will be critical to the way that we work on project design. So we have taken into account the feedback of a number of stakeholders, even, pre-agreement to the lease, and then we'll continue to consult with them as we work on project design, planting design, and ultimately implementation. In this particular case, our key stakeholders, in addition to the State Land Board, are the Colorado State Forest Service, who help the land board manage their their portfolio of forested land. And they have district foresters who often know the properties where we're going to be working very well. They have a good sense of land use history. They will weigh in on the species selection and mix that we're proposing for given sites. And, they will participate in site visits with us. That's really key. For some of the sites that are of particular biological importance, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, another agency, will weigh in, again, on the design, on the potential impact that has across a larger landscape. Some of our sites actually neighbor the U.S. Forest Service land, so that's another stakeholder that we bring in specific areas. We have stakeholders who are either currently grazing these properties or graze adjacent properties, another core stakeholder to bring into the process. And so again, this is, not only important to get, key information to make sure that we're putting the right trees in the right place, but also part of long-term buy-in, so that you're actually ensuring that, people who are living on or near this land and have an impact on the future of it agree and buy into what you're doing. Ultimately, this kind of collaboration and this kind of engagement makes it possible for you to start thinking about, well, how does this property connect to the next property? And what does that mean for the way that we're thinking about, restoration across a broader landscape, as you mentioned?
Been talking a lot about carbon so far, but the Nature Tech Collective is very focused on nature as the sector. And so since these are wildfire devastated lands, is there any special consideration that goes into your planning and the species selection especially?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Just before this call, I was double checking these numbers. When we think about wildfire impacted areas in the US and of course beyond, we're talking about huge areas, the majority of which will never receive active intervention, right? And so we're this, small piece of it. It's almost, last year alone, 2024, 9 million acres of forest in the US, so 3.6 million hectares burned. So again, just to kind of put in perspective what we're dealing with here. We focus on, again, always native species, a mix of species. That's important in and of itself. When you think about wildfire prevention, we know the ways that monoculture make wildfires more common, more prevalent. In these areas where wildfires are occurring, often we're dealing with fire-adapted species that would survive, or some of them would survive a typical wildfire. But again, as I mentioned, the catastrophic wildfires that we're seeing now are making species that otherwise would have survived not survive. So, what we're seeing is most often it's the management and prevention of wildfires that's most important, not what you're doing afterwards, beyond, again, building a native resilient forest.
Right.
Um, and I think, just to build on that, and I think you're going to kind of ask a bit more about how we think about the future of climate, right? And how we future-proof projects.
Yeah.
This is an area that's hotly debated, right? Should you choose species? What do you do from a climate modeling perspective to look forward and think about what a given area is likely to be like in 50 years or 100 years or 200 years, like the lifetime of a tree? And and what does that mean for species selection? So you get into this hot debate about what is a native species now, and will that shift in the future, and what climate model do you use? So I think there's still a lot more research needed in order to inform the way that this that we make choices about this ecologically. So right now we focus on, species that we know belong today in a particular area, but we are participating in research in a number of different places about things, about that kind of climate proofing. So, for example, in Europe, we're part of a project called the Green Link, which is taking a species of tree from Morocco, planting it in southern Spain, and evaluating its survival there. So that's part of a, EU research consortium. And that kind of thing is going to be core to how I think the larger restoration movement thinks about these sorts of complicated, not straightforward decisions.
Wow. So you basically have to do almost a sort of mini science fiction experiment in some ways. I'm so glad we brought that up. I didn't know. I'm going to cycle us through the questions just a tiny bit faster, but I really want to get to into the question of the impact measurement. So you're still kind of starting the site and slowly getting to the reforestation piece. Once that's in, you do have some interesting thoughts about how do we measure the progress of what's going on, and how are you also doing the bits that are not just carbon but biodiversity and water and things like that.
Yep. So, of course, and we'll get into this more when we talk about the financing piece of this, the way that we're able to pay for our work right now is through carbon finance. And so that is the thing that we pay most attention to when we're talking about impact measurement. It's the thing that we are paid to measure. And so Land Life registers the vast majority of its projects under Verra. And so we have, VCS credits that are issued from those projects. We follow their, monitoring and evaluation protocol in order to monitor biomass accumulation over time. And that is an important part of understanding our impact, ensuring that trees are still in the ground, ensuring that trees are growing the way that we expected to grow, adjusting, carbon projections based on what we're actually seeing happening, et cetera. We're hoping to add to this site a component of measuring impact on erosion and therefore on water quality downstream, which we know is a very important topic in Colorado. Think about the Colorado River and all of the downstream watershed effects of that. So that's something that we'd really like to be able to add in, but it requires that someone wants to pay for measuring that particular impact. So that's something that's always in the back of our head of, can we find the right partner who wants to think about the beyond carbon impact of a project? And we do have pilots not in North America, but in Indonesia and in Spain, where we're doing a suite of biodiversity measurements specifically using a combination of eDNA, bioacoustics, and remote sensing analysis of different structural factors of forests.
Fantastic. And so since we are in this carbon market, can you tell us a tiny bit more about your carbon modeling approach and how you've refined it to show biomass accumulation from year 0 to 40?
Yeah. So the carbon modeling system that we've built in-house, which we call FastTrack, we always laugh that we build these internal names and then we really should have thought about branding a little bit earlier. But FastTrack was developed by Dr. Koen Kramer, it was previously at a research institution in the Netherlands and now works as our director of science at Land Life, based on decades and decades of research. It models how trees grow within a system, and it is fed by species-specific data that are paired to a site's local conditions. So it allows us to estimate total accumulation over the 40-year period and also gives us a year-by-year view of accumulation. So, basically it allows us to look at how are trees likely to compete with each other when they're next to each other. And what does that mean for growth? What do we expect mortality to look like given the particular conditions? How does elevation and precipitation temperature impact growth rates? And it models those things, taking as much local data as possible and applying it to this ecological restoration concept. I think one of the reasons why we built this in-house and couldn't just look toward external models is that most models, at least at the national level across the countries where we work, are built for the timber industry. So they really, A, are often looking at monocultures, and B, really only care about biomass after year 20 when you're likely to harvest. And so those early years, when it really matters from the perspective of a credit issuance timeline,
Right.
that just doesn't exist out there. So we have adapted the model for each of the geographies where we work, and then have actually started to get peer review. We've done this in Australia to show that our particular model that we've built is more accurate than national level models. And so that's been a very important part for us of building up our ability to predict what accumulation of biomass and carbon looks like over time.
So still on the subject of markets, one of the big questions always in the Nature Tech Collective is, what's the business case for nature restoration? So specifically here, the business case for reforestation in slow growing areas is challenging. Can you just expand a little bit more on how you're making that financial side work?
Yeah, of course. So we often work in not only highly degraded, but dry areas, temperate areas. And that means that your overall carbon accumulation may not be as high as places in the tropics. And also the speed at which things are growing is much slower. And that also impacts the business case. So a few ways that we manage this. Some are really boring, like keeping costs low, and the ways that we use technology and the ways that allows us to be efficient is a piece of that. I talked about the way that FastTrack, our forest carbon model, really uses local data. Because of that, it allows us to identify areas that at a national level might be missed that actually have the potential for a viable carbon accumulation curve. So that's been an important part of how we've been very site specific about where we work and how we're able to make a carbon business case there. And then, honestly, a lot of our projects, buyers will pay a premium because we're able to show the integrity of the project. We're able to show that, we're working in places with very secure land tenure, which, offers often a nice balance to a portfolio that carbon credit buyers may be looking for. And we also have to find the right buyers. We need patient investors. We need buyers who understand that in certain parts of the world, they're not going to get a credit in the first 5 years of the project. And so it's also just about finding the right partners who are interested in the particular geographies where we're working. All those things have to come together in order for us to be able to fund restoration in the particular way that we do.
That makes sense as well. I'm gonna skip those two last questions that we had signposted to kind of get us to finish on actually if there are any other nature tech providers or potential off-takers listening today or in the future to this recording, what's your request or call to action for them?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. So for our work in Colorado, we have an investor in place who's funded a lot of the private landowner work that we're doing and continuing to look to help us grow in the region. And we're looking for the right off-taker or off-takers to work with us on this particular opportunity where we're, again, balancing environmental impact and social impact. So we really invite interested kind of strategy and value aligned buyers to approach us and talk about what it might look like to think about carbon credits from this region.
Much, Clara, for all of that. That was so interesting and so clear. And I learned a lot, even if I've already talked to you about all of this.